I'm here with Katy Faust, president of Them Before Us and co-author of Them Before Us: Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement. Katy, welcome to Brave New Us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Samantha. Really good to join you.
Can you start by briefly introducing yourself and sharing how you came to be doing the work that you're doing?
Yes, I am here by accident. I was not intending to do any of this. 10 years ago, I was just a stay-at-home mom and a pastor's wife and very focused on grace giving. Like I wanted to maintain relationships and not rock the boat and not lose any friends. But what I heard, especially beginning in the marriage debate, was the weaponization of some of the greatest harms and wounds that you can inflict on children for the sake of advancing a political goal. Namely, the idea that kids don't care if they have two moms or two dads, which was sort of a popular talking point in the lead up to legalization of gay marriage. And what that functionally means is kids don't care if they've lost their mom or lost their dad, because anytime you're looking at a picture of a kid with two moms, that is a kid who does not have their father loving them and raising them every day. And when you're looking at a picture of a kid with two dads, you are looking at a child who very likely was intentionally motherless. And I've been working with kids for 25 years and doing youth ministry. I used to work in adoption. I've not yet met a kid that didn't care. I've not yet met a kid that wasn't at minimum curious, but very often it inflicted a lifelong wound where they wanted to know, who is my mother? Does she know that I exist? Why did my father leave me and run off with his secretary and leave me with, without him? When children experience mother or father loss, it impacts every level of their life. Sometimes that happens through tragedy and we mourn. But what I see increasingly, beginning with the marriage debate, and now I see in every other conversation about marriage and family, every other topic about this, whether it's cohabitation or divorce or same-sex parenting or reproductive technologies, is that the desire and the identity and the feelings of adult is exalted to the highest good. And children, their rights, needs, well-beings, and desires are the required sacrifice. So that's what Them Before Us is about. We are seeking to put them, the children, before us, the adults, in all conversations about marriage and family, and specifically to defend their fundamental natural right to be known and loved by both mother and father.
Beautiful. So when we were setting up this interview, you gave kind of a disclaimer and asked me, are you sure? Because most people aren't willing to go the places that we go. And I thought that was really interesting. And I'd love to just start there. And we kind of already, I think we've gotten there a little bit. But what are some of those other hard lines that you draw? And why do you think it is so challenging for people to get on board?
Well, I often tell people when I give an introduction to what I do, I say, give me enough time and I'll piss you off too. Because there is nobody that gets a pass. In the world of children's rights, if children have a right to their mother and father, no adult gets a pass. The idea that children have a right to their mother and father is going to make demands on every adult at some point. Every adult at some point. At some point, every adult is going to have to decide, am I going to do the hard thing in this situation, or is the kid going to have to do something hard in this situation? Because in challenging marriage and family conversations and debates, these are very hard situations of same-sex attraction or struggling marriages or unwanted singleness or infertility, right? These are some of the greatest burdens that adults are going to experience. But the only alternative to adults burdening themselves and figuring out how to solve that by doing something hard is to burden children and insist that they do something hard. So, for example, when I start talking about children having a right to their mother and father and the importance of biological connection with children, my friends on the right very often get very defensive because they say, oh, you're attacking adoption, right? And many of them are adoptive parents or are adopted themselves or just know people that they love who have taken on the burden of welcoming a child without a mother and father into their life. And so they're threatened by that message. My friends on the left obviously perceive this as being an anti-gay message. Well, you're saying that gays and lesbians can't be parents. I've shot video curriculum where some of the film crew would not come because I talk about how IVF is not a child-friendly technology and that IVF is not about babies. It's about on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide.
Right.
And the fact that only 93% of children created through IVF will be born alive. And that industry, that baby making industry, takes more embryonic life every year than the baby taking industry, abortion. So that's what I mean. That's what I'm saying. That this is a worldview. This is a message that says children have a right to their mother and father. All of you, single, married, gay, straight, fertile, and infertile, need to conform to the rights of children rather than insisting that children sacrifice for you. So if you have not already been triggered by listening to this podcast, give me a little time and you might start to feel that, hey, wait a second, feeling as well. But what you are going to see is the requirement for child defense is insisting that all adults defend all children, regardless of what adults it may upset at the time.
So I think most people would agree that children do have rights, but when it comes to specifics, people are less likely to agree what those rights are. So why do children have special rights, and why is it worth sacrificing those desires that we have as adults for their sake?
Well, it's very hard to use the term rights these days and even know what a right is. You know, like to quote The Incredibles, when everything is a right, nothing is a right. And everything these days is a right. I mean, we listen to people talk about how they have a right to housing and a right to government-funded birth control and a right to choose and a right to parenthood and a right to marry and all of these different things. It's strange that whatever adults really, 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 really want is conveniently framed as a right. So there is a lot of confusion about what a right is. So we spend a little bit of time in the first chapter of our book talking about what makes something a natural right. Because the truth is that your audience is already very familiar with the reality that children have rights. Many of them have probably been devoting their life to fight for a children's right to life. And they've been doing that for decades. Well, that child has a right to life, even if they don't have a civil right, even if it's not recognized as a civil right, even if it's not recognized in our laws, they have a natural right to life. And the natural right is going to be true whether or not it's recognized by the government. So the same metric that we can use to determine that children have a natural right to life, we can also use to determine that children have a right to be known and loved by the two people responsible for their existence, their mother and father. So we walk through sort of a template for determining what is and is not a natural right in the first chapter of our book. And very, very briefly, a natural right is something that existed pre-government. It's not something the government gives to you. A natural right doesn't have to be provided to you. Somebody doesn't have to dig it up from the ground and bottle it and package it and ship it and put it on a shelf. A natural right is something that everybody has in equal measure. You know, a Mar-a-Lago versus a dorm room is, you know, housing is not a natural right because you can have different distribution levels. So you look at both a child's right to life and a child's right to their parent, and they did exist pre-government. Nobody has to provide it to you. If you exist, you have it. And third, everybody gets the exact same amount. You get one life, and you get two parents. So we, I would say, use natural rights and the term rights in the way that it should be used. I would say that our friends on the left very often adulterate the term children's rights and use it to smuggle in all kinds of child harming ideologies. So we're using it properly, and I think the term needs to be redeemed because the concept of children's rights and defending their rights has, I think, been one of the biggest tools that we have used to move both culture and law on the pro-life issue. We need to look at, you know, abortion as children's rights 1.0, and we need to start looking at marriage and family as children's rights 2.0.
I think it's really beautiful the way that you're phrasing this, our friends on the left and our friends on the right. You don't hear that a lot in discourse these days, bringing that out and just being able to hear somebody say, you know, I know we disagree on these things, but we can still have conversations about them. I think that that's so important. Could you say a little bit more about why you're choosing that phrase and how maybe listeners might reframe some of the things that we've been taught or habitualized into saying or thinking through media, social media.
Well, let me be clear. The ideas that are being pushed largely from the left are wicked and child harming. But I think the motivations of most people on the left is not to destroy. I think that it is misdirected compassion very much of the time. So a lot of the work that we're doing is to say, our friends on the left who, for example, are so passionate about social justice, right? They are passionate for a reason because they genuinely care about the well-being of society and especially children. And so we make the point in chapter 1 to say, we know that you are manning the suicide prevention lines and volunteering, in school with the at-risk kids and big brother, big sister, and concerned about high incarceration rates. We know. You will never help any of those kids. You will never get any level of social justice for those kids unless you secure individual justice for the individual child. Because there's something about suicide, high school dropout rates, high incarceration rates, teen poverty, teen homelessness, that there's something in common there. And that is that they are overpopulated with fatherless children, right? That is what they have in common. So please continue to work to limit the effects of what the fallout of that. But if you think that giving another $100 million to decrease child poverty is going to move the needle, it won't. What moves the needle is defending children's right to their mother and father, because those kids are 4 times less likely to live in poverty. And that's just how it is, right? Despite the fact that poverty spending has skyrocketed in the last 60 years. So, we talk to our friends on the right, and they also very often have noble goals, even if you're just talking about like the economic conservatives, the one that don't really, they're kind of libertarian on social issues. We say, do you want small government? Do you want low taxes? Do you want personal responsibility? Then you need to get on the them before us train, because you're never going to get any of those things that you want, right? You cannot have small government unless you have big marriage, period. You don't get to have limited government and responsible citizenship unless you have maximized the number of kids being raised by their married mother and father. So there is something for people on both sides. Both sides largely are well motivated. And I know that because I've talked to people on the left who, when they hear the argument, don't necessarily abandon their political position, but now understand that they cannot achieve their political goals unless they get right down to the child level, one by one, individual child to individual child.
Right. Yeah. One of our activists from the Catholic tradition was Dorothy Day, and she said, "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist." And I think what she was getting at is the same thing. It's about not just cleaning up what's coming downriver, but actually going upriver and saying, why, what is the source of this? Why is this happening? So that makes a lot of sense. But going back to this idea that same-sex parenthood or deliberately chosen single parenthood fails to meet children's needs, why isn't it enough that kids are safe and loved?
Yeah, so we don't have to guess about these questions. This is not something that has suddenly arrived on the scene where we go, oh my gosh, we don't know anything about how to evaluate whether or not these pairings or this arrangement is good for kids. We've been studying family structure for decades. And way before the question of same-sex parenting or single motherhood by choice, for example, came on the scene, we already had a lot of data about what it took for children to be safe and loved. And overwhelmingly, even today, even left-leaning sources will say children fare best when raised in the home of their married biological mother and father. That is the formula that most leads to child thriving. That's not to say that there aren't exceptions on both sides. There are some horrible, abusive, intact biological families, and there are some saintly step families or, 2 moms or 2 dads that are pouring into their kids the best they can, right? But from a data perspective and from a natural law perspective, what we see is there is one formula that secures child's rights thriving and that maximizes the likelihood that they will be safe and loved. So why is that, right? Why is that? And the short answer is biology matters. Biology matters in the parent-child relationship for 3 reasons. Number 1, only the 2 people responsible for a child's existence can grant them something that they crave, and that is their biological identity. It is very hard to answer the question, who am I, if you cannot answer the question, whose am I? And so what we see, like, that is validated by looking at the populations that grew up without one or both biological parents. When you look at adoptees and the surveys of adoptees, they overwhelmingly talk about how they long to know their first family, even if they can't be raised by them. And that is the very reason why we've had a huge shift in the way we do adoptions in this country over the last 60 years, away from overwhelmingly closed adoptions to now about 95% of adoptions are open adoptions, where the child has some knowledge or contact or relationship with their biological mother and or father. And we can also look at the children created through third parties, somebody else's sperm or somebody else's egg or somebody else's embryo completely. And we see they desperately want to know the identity of their biological mother or father for health reasons, so they can have complete health, so they can understand where they get their different traits from. But very often they actually want a relationship with the person that donated their genetic material because it's their dad, it's their mom, and that's how they think about it. So biological identity is a huge part of identity consolidation and building a healthy, stable foundation of self-understanding. So that's the reason, number 1, why biology matters. Number 2 is this idea about being safe and loved. Like, whether it's because of our sinful fallen nature or whether it's because of evolutionary forces that where you want to invest in only your genetic posterity that's going to carry on your genes, it is undisputed that biological parents are more invested in, connected to, and protective of their kids. So we've got loads of research in chapter 2 of our book talking about this reality. But you don't have to read all the research, even though if you did, you would be an expert, and I guarantee you'd walk away being fortified and understanding why this matters. But you can do 2 quick things to fact check me on this. Number 1, you can Google the term Cinderella effect. And this is a term that is acknowledged among sociologists of the detrimental and uneven and unequal treatment that children receive when they're being raised by an unrelated adult, a stepmother, a stepfather, mother's boyfriend, father's girlfriend, any unrelated adult in the home, especially one that's in a romantic relationship with the child's parent. The Cinderella effect shows us that, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson coined this phrase, and they did research on the rates of increase of child death at the hands of mother's husband or mother's boyfriend. And it was like 200 times that a child was more likely to be beaten to death or killed by an unrelated man. Statistically, an unrelated man sharing living space with the child is the most dangerous person in a child's life. It poses a great risk to kids. Our society talks about how if the adults are happy, the kids will be happy. And kids just need 2 parents and biology doesn't matter. Well, if that was the case, then kids who are living with their mother and her live-in boyfriend would be doing great. But if you Google the words mother's boyfriend, you will be shocked by tens of thousands of returns of the most horrific child abuse and torture that you're ever going to find on the internet. So biology matters if we genuinely care about kids being safe and loved. And finally, biology matters because if we can respect a child's right to be known and loved by both biological parents, they will get the perfect gender balance in the home 100% of the time. They will get the developmental benefits of maternal love that talks to kids differently, disciplines differently, cares for children differently, maximizes different motor skills differently. Then they'll get the benefits of dad, right, who is more direct in his talk, uses more advanced language in his words, is more aggressive and competitive and develops their gross motor skills. The one who is more focused on abstract ideas of right and wrong and just do what I say. And sometimes you just have to obey versus mom who says, oh, honey, I understand. It's going to be okay. You've got one parent that's nurturing and kissing when the kid falls off the monkey bars, you've got another parent saying, get up and do it again, just go faster this time. I mean, like if you get both biological parents in the home, you literally could not, and we have not, as a human species, we have not yet found an arrangement that better sets kids up for thriving, helps them understand who they are, and maximizes their development than a child being raised by their married biological mother and father. So that was a very long lead up to get to your question, to say, once you understand those unbending factors, those unbending realities of who children are and what they need, it's very easy to say, well, what's the problem with single motherhood by choice? Well, you're always cutting out half of the child's biological identity. You're always starving them of paternal love that will maximize their development. And sometimes there's another man that may come into that child's life who will statistically put that child at risk. What's the problem with two moms, right? Same-sex parenting. Well, you're always cutting out a biological adult to whom children have a natural right. You're always depriving them of that biological identity. Two mothers, 10 mothers will never grant the child the developmental benefits of a man, of a father. And the child will always be living with one unrelated adult who statistically diminishes their outcomes. So that's one thing Them Before Us does, which is a little helpful. It's a template that you can lay over the top of any question about modern family and come up with the answer that most honors children's rights.
Yeah, I think you've done a fantastic job of diving into, why biology matters, why gender matters. Can we go back to this idea of children faring better in these situations and talk a little bit about maybe what the measure of faring better looks like? How you did talk about, the risk that comes with living with an unrelated male, but can we talk about maybe some of those other measures to determine what fare better really means?
Yeah, well, what do you want to look at? Do you want to look at their physical health, their mental health, their emotional health, their academic health, their relational health? I mean, really, you can look at any different area of what it means to be human and see that there is a deficit when children are deprived of a relationship with their mother or father. So physical health, we see that children who experience father loss, for example, suffer physically. So children whose father died, who lost them to divorce or lost them to incarceration. They did a study a couple of years ago that measured the telomeres, the end caps of the chromosomes responsible for health and longevity. And what they found is children who lost their father had shorter telomeres. It literally shortens their lifespan. It changes the shape of their cells, right? It affects them to the cellular level if they don't have their dad in their life. Girls who grew up without a father, without their biological father, to be clear, even if they have a stepfather in the home, children without their biological father on average start to menstruate 1 year earlier than the girls who don't have their father in their home. There's no agreement among social scientists about why this is, but nobody disputes that that's the case, right? So it is affecting children's physical bodies to not have their right to their mother and father respected. You look at things like cohabitation, right? Where the child is, even in situations where the child is brought into a home where they're born to both mother and father, but the mother and father are cohabiting. Those children have higher rates of obesity than children who are born to their married mother and father. Those children are 4 times more likely to live in poverty, 3 times more likely to experience sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, right? Very often because cohabiting relationships don't cohabit forever. They break up. It's much more unstable. And so those kids born to cohabiting relationships very often then get on multiple merry-go-rounds of different partners or spouses coming in and out of the child's life, and the instability and the split focus and the unrelated adults that go along with it. So physically, you've got all kinds of physical impacts to the child. Emotionally and mentally, we see a pretty huge, significant impact on kids, for example, of divorce, right? Because what divorce is, sometimes divorce is the right response in extreme cases, but these days about 70% of divorces break up low conflict marriages, right? So it's not the marriages that are throwing plates across the kitchen and yelling and screaming. 70% of the time, the kids never saw it coming. right? And so what happens to those kids? Well, there was a study done about 10 years ago. No, it was earlier. Elizabeth Margaret studied kids from good divorces, right? The ones that supposedly everything was okay. Mom and dad just needed to be happy. There wasn't abuse. There wasn't, adultery. It was just, we needed to move on. What she found is that in 50% of cases of kids living in two different homes, those kids developed two different personalities. They literally had to become a different person on the drive from dad's house to mom's house because mom and dad had different religions. Mom and dad had different political persuasions. Mom and dad had them keep different secrets. There were people at this house that barely knew that people at this house existed, right? The only person that understood the child's world going back and forth was that kid, and maybe siblings if they were also caught in the push and pull of both of those parents. So mentally, it has a huge impact on kids. Relationally, children who grow up in divorced homes, for example, are much more likely to get the divorce themselves. About 50%, it increases their divorce rate by 50%. So that it's harder for them to form and maintain their own relationships. And what's fascinating is if a child's parents divorce and they don't remarry, their risk of divorce themselves is only 50% greater. But if mom or dad go ahead and remarried, their likelihood of divorce goes up to 90%.
Oh my goodness.
So something about seeing their mother or father remarry actually increases the likelihood that they themselves will get divorced. So we are, when you mess with a kid's childhood, you mess with their whole life. There is no part of a child's life, their physical body, their academic success. We could talk about academics. You look at the rates of failure or dropout for kids who are Asian, white, Hispanic, Black, and you see that, Asians perform best in terms of GPAs, test scores, graduation rates. Asians are at the top, whites next, Hispanics next, Black students next. And what you see is that tracks almost exactly with the number of intact families that these kids are raised in. And there's a study that was done on Black kids, for example, who are absolutely disadvantaged when it comes to academics. But what they found is for the Black kids, the 13% of Black kids make it to their high school graduation living only with their married biological mother and father. Only 13%. 87% are going to experience some kind of family breakdown. But for those 13% that had mother and father love and stability all through their education, especially if mom and dad were religious, there was no academic discrepancy. So this doesn't have to do with race. This has to do with the fact that these are human children. All human children need the same thing. They all need their mother and father loving them and loving one another all of their life. So there's no area, physical, emotional, academic, relational, that will not be impacted when we disrespect children's rights. And then we look around and we wonder, gosh, why are kids struggling these days? It's because we're starving them. We are starving them of what they need.
Yeah, you have spoken so well to this claim that, children need happy parents because happy parents are good for the children, and doing what makes the parents happy will benefit them. But could you speak a little bit to those those married parents who were maybe considering divorce or thinking about and feeling like they're in a tough spot? Could you maybe speak into that a little bit? And what would you say to them at this point in their lives, in their marriage, when they're on the brink of that decision?
What you're going through is a huge burden. And I can say that with confidence, not just because I've been married for 25 years and we had a rough couple of years. There was a year or two where we felt more like enemies than friends. There are seasons, and those seasons are heavy and they're hard. Thankfully, most of our marriage has been sweet and wonderful, but there were patches. But I can tell you, I understand where you're coming from, because when I'm not activisting, I'm in my husband's office with him doing marriage counseling or counseling people who are dealing with porn addiction, job loss, childhood baggage that's just now resurfacing, and they're trying to figure communication issues, other traumas that have happened in their adult life that has thrown a wrench into their marriage. The kind of things that you are struggling with are very significant. And I understand that you are incredibly burdened by them. And there are times to at least separate if not divorce, especially if you are in danger or your children are in danger. In those cases, I hope that you have a community that will surround you with support and hold the misbehaving spouse accountable for their misbehavior. But that's not most marriages. Most marriages are simply going to go through a short or long rough patch related to money or connection
1 second.
or
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Can I help you? Yes? You need to ask your dad right now, honey. He's watching you. I'm having an interview. So sorry.
don't cut that out. You keep that in this podcast. Like, welcome to mom life. Welcome to mom life. Yeah, no, I love it so much. So most marriages are going to go through rough patches, but don't lull yourself into the lie that if you're happy, the kids will be happy. Don't believe the falsehood that let me tell you really what divorce is. So first of all, if you really believe this will be no big deal for my kids, I hate to say get my book, but I will send you the divorce chapter in my book. If you don't want to purchase the book, you can email me and I will just send you portions of the divorce chapter where you can read for yourself what kids experience post-divorce. In fact, I just wrote an article in the Federalist last month that said it was about 9 kids on the moment they knew that their parents' marriage was over. And what you'll see in those 9 testimonies is it affected children primarily in 2 ways. In fact, when I got the responses, I couldn't believe that they all talked about how it impacted the way they saw themselves and it impacted the way they interacted with other people forever. So first you have to understand how this is going to affect your kids, right? Don't believe the lie that it's no big deal, that it's like a cold, that the kids will get over it. That is not how divorce is. If there's, and again, I'm not talking about abuse, abandonment, addiction. I'm talking about the burdens that every marriage goes through that can at times feel like a fire that's so hot that you want to jump out of the pot. Okay. What divorce is at its heart is when the adults say, this cross is too heavy for me, because it is a cross. What you're going through is hard. But divorce is when the adults say, this cross is too heavy for me. Here, kids, you take it instead. Someone is going to be burdened. It will either be you or it will be your children. And it is an injustice to offload that burden onto the shoulders of your children. You are supposed to carry it.
Yeah, and I wonder too, if going back to that moment when you're sitting there with people who are bearing these things in their marriages, I wonder if in those moments, a lot of it is not necessarily that my spouse is the problem. I wonder how much of this idea that divorce will make me happy is really a falsehood and a scapegoating of the spouse for those other issues that they're trying to work through or to battle through, the crosses that they're bearing.
Right. And the studies show that 50% of people who go through divorce are no happier after the divorce. And very often, if you go through the divorce and you get remarried, you simply recreate the same situation in your next marriage. That's why 2nd and 3rd and 4th marriages have much higher divorce rates than first marriages, because there's probably something in the marriage that has to do with you that you have to figure out how to deal with and work on. Because if you think it's just them, and I've seen enough struggling marriages to know, you know what, normally one person is much more at fault. One person really has more issues they need to work out. But I have yet to see a situation where it's like, yeah, both parties, like one was completely spotless, you know? So this is not the escape that you think it is. It would offer you temporary relief, but in the long term, there's a very good chance that this is not going to give you the relief that you think you're going to find in divorce.
Yeah, so it really is a gamble, and the children always lose.
Right.
Wow. So pivoting a little bit, and we mentioned this a little bit, but maybe we can go into it in a little bit more detail. How do children's rights factor into the world of donor conception and surrogacy?
So this is another area where, it's sort of acceptable to talk about the gays and why they're the problem. That's more comfortable for us kind of on the conservative Christian side of things.
Mm.
But the reality is that heterosexuals, even sweet Christian heterosexual couples, have been violating the rights of children through reproductive technologies for a long time. And the truth is that anytime a child is conceived using a third party, somebody else's sperm, somebody else's egg, somebody else's womb, you're always violating the rights of that child, even if they're being raised by a loving mother and father. You are always cutting them off from half of their biological identity. They're always going to be sharing living spaces with an unrelated adult. And very often that adult is less connected to the child, often through no fault of their own, right? We have a variety of stories in chapter 7 of our book that looks specifically at donor conception, where these kids just feel like there's a disconnect with what they would call their social parent. Like they've even coined a term for the adult that raises them, but that isn't their biological parent. They call it their social parent. And it's hard to connect with your social parent. And then very often, if there is a divorce or a breakdown, which statistically is more likely in donor conception arrangements, they lose contact with that social parent altogether, because either the social parent often thinks, well, that's not mine anyway.
Mm.
So it is not ideal for kids. And this is a part of the message, again, where people on the right have a strong response, because the answer is no adult should be using third parties to make children. No adult. It doesn't matter if you're single or married, fertile or infertile, Christian or Catholic, or super, super nice. It is always a violation of the rights of children to use somebody else's sperm or egg to make a baby. These kids often deal with feelings of commodification, like they were purchased and designed because they were chosen from a catalog and purchased and designed. They often feel like eugenics is at play, because one of the reasons why only 7% of lab-created babies are born alive is because you screen the undesirables out of existence, or you freeze the leftovers for later use or never use. And so there's a lot of identity questions and ethical questions that these kids are working through. On the issue of surrogacy, this is also one where unfortunately there's too much moral confusion, even among people who supposedly are pro-life. And the easiest way to understand what surrogacy is that it splices what should be one woman, a mother, into 3 purchasable and optional women. The first one is the genetic mother who gives the egg, offers the egg. The second one is the birth mother, in whose womb the child grows and learns and gestates for 9.5 months. And the third is the social mother, that female presence in the life of the child every day. And surrogacy says, which of these 3 do you need? Which one do you have to purchase? Which one do you don't want? Which one are you going to provide for yourself? But the reality is that when all 3 of these are not found in the same woman, the child experiences loss. And surrogacy allows to cut children off from all 3 if the commissioning parents have the right amount of money. So sometimes children lose a mother at birth due to tragedy, and we mourn. And that is when a just society seeks to mend that wound through adoption. But surrogacy inflicts that maternal wound on purpose, and usually through a commercial process. So I have an article called "Yes, Surrogacy is Wrong When Straight Couples Do It." Because I think a lot of us think, oh, but aren't there exceptions for the people that we love? Aren't there exceptions for the couples that we know that would be incredible mothers and fathers? And the answer is no. No. It's never acceptable to insist that a child sacrifices so you can have what you want, even if what you want is innate and noble and good. Adults do not ask kids to sacrifice for them.
Yeah, and I just want to point out the Catholic source, the document, if anybody's looking for it, on this right that children have to be conceived, carried, and brought up by their natural parents. That's the direct wording, is in the document Donum Vitae. So for anybody who wants a Catholic citation on that. I want to go back to something that you said about this idea of screening the children that then are chosen. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how that type of mentality in approaching parenthood prepares potential parents for parenthood differently than the sort of, well, we're having a kid and we get what we get and that's what we get, kind of the thing that has been the way that people have reproduced for so many years, and now it's there's the potential for it to be different. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, anytime there's money involved, right, you're now talking about, look, I'm paying for this. I need to get what I'm paying for. And so we've got several lawsuits in play right now. I think the ones that I'm thinking of, a gay couple and a lesbian couple who are suing their fertility clinic because they got their order wrong. You implanted the wrong embryo. This isn't what we ordered. And I think that, well, I know IVF offers those kinds of screenings exactly because when it's $12 to $20 a pop per fertility, per chance, per implantation, you're paying a lot of money. A lot of these people are going into debt to facilitate their IVF. They've got to get, they may not have the money to try this again. So you want to implant the one that's the most viable. I've talked to people who are pro-life Christians who have gone through IVF. A handful of them have done it in a way that does not violate any child's right to life or any child's right to a mother and father, but they fought the fertility clinic the entire way. Why? Because the fertility clinic has numbers they need to maintain, right? They need to plant. They need to maximize their live birth rate, right? So that they can say, hey, you should use our services. So they will discourage you from not creating surplus embryos, not discarding the undesirables, not, donating to research the ones that don't make the grade. So how does that impact your mentality? Well, and this is another area where people get really uncomfortable. We often talk about how abortion and reproductive technologies are two sides of the same child commodifying coin, right? Abortion says, if a child is unwanted, I can violate their right to life and force them out of existence. And IVF and reproductive technologies say, if a child is very wanted, I can violate their right to life, or some kids' right to life. I can violate their right to their mother and father by forcing them into existence, right? And even the children who do survive are at increased risk of a whole host of physical and psychological challenges. We have a post on our website called IVF Harms Children, and it is a clearinghouse for all the studies that we know and all of the stats that we have on how kids are at increased risk of cancer or autoimmune disorders because they were conceived by a technician and not in the loving embrace of their mother and father. So getting back to what you kind of alluded to, there is a difference from begetting children to making children, right? That we want children to be begotten, not made. And when you are making children, you do have more of a authority over whether they live or die, what kind of human comes to being. And that does not put us in the right place. We don't make new life. And if we try to make new life, it certainly can change our perception of what can be done with that new life.
Yeah. So to play devil's advocate a little bit, if both adoption and IVF are ways of helping infertile couples obtain a child, why is adoption distinctly acceptable?
Good. Because adoption is not about giving children to infertile couples. Adoption is not about helping people to form their families. That's not what adoption is. Adoption is a just society's response to children who have lost their parents. So when I used to work at the adoption agency, I worked at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world before I had kids. And we would often say, the adults are paying us, but they're not our client. If adoption is done well, every child that needs a home is going to be placed with loving parents, but not every adult who wants a kid is going to get one. If adoption is successful, sometimes the answer to some adults is no. And so we spend quite a lot of time in chapter 9 of our book contrasting adoption and reproductive technologies, right? That first of all, nobody has a right to get kids, right? Adoption is not a way for adults to get kids. Adoption is a way to find loving homes for children who have lost them. Similarly, You don't have a right to get kids by using somebody else's sperm or egg or embryo or womb. Children have a right to their mother and father. So the answer for those two scenarios is nobody should use reproductive technologies. Everybody violates the rights of children when they use somebody else's sperm, egg, womb, or embryo.
Mhm.
Children have a right, adults don't have a right to an adopted child. Children have a right to be adopted, right? It's their needs, their longings, their rights, their well-being, their best interest that is central to considerations for placement. It's not, oh, I want a baby, I'm infertile, this is my way of having children. Sometimes those two things work together. I know people who have been infertile or experienced secondary infertility who then have said, okay, let's seek to adopt. But the primary consideration is not how do we give you kids? The primary consideration is what is best for this child. So we spend quite a bit of time trying to recenter people's thought process about adoption. It's not about adults, it's about kids.
What do you think about a couple of emerging potential technologies? I guess one of them, embryo adoption, wouldn't be emerging. That would be something that's already being practiced. But then also the idea of artificial wombs eventually, because they are in development, they've been used with animals. So eventually somebody will likely try this with human beings. And so maybe those are two different things, but we can go with the embryo adoption first and then.
It's very good. We need to be thinking about these questions because it's about to get, you think it's bad now. Dystopia is right around the corner. So I wouldn't say the embryo adoption is dystopic, but what it is it's trying to deal with the problem of the fact that we have 1 million souls on ice in this country, 1 million frozen embryos. By some estimates, 20 to 40% of them have been abandoned. They don't know who the parents are. They can't contact them. They can't track them down. What do you do? What do you do, right? So the American Society for Reproductive Medicine offers 3 options for surplus embryos, like leftover humans. That's really what they're saying. You can thaw and discard, you can donate to research, or you can donate to another family, right? And the reality is all of those violate the rights of children. Like you can thaw and discard yourself, but you don't get to thaw and discard someone else. You can donate yourself to research, but you don't get to donate somebody else's body to research. You could donate yourself to another family, but you don't get to, you cannot donate your current children to somebody else's family. These are children, they have rights. So what is the way to deal with surplus embryos? The answer is go get them. They're your children. You made them, implant them in your womb, give them a chance at life. Even if that means you have to take out a loan or buy a bigger van or expand your house or go move in with your parents so that you can handle more children than you originally planned. For the kids that don't have that option, embryo adoption is the only child honoring option. But there are risks, right? It does not do anything to stem the terrible practice of creating dozens of surplus embryos. I did an article about this at the Federalist that interviews several children conceived through sperm and egg donation that are very concerned about embryo adoption, making it look as though, hey, this is a great way to help kids, but it's not. In their mind, this is a way to give, a get out of jail free card to an industry that is rampantly violating the rights of children. So if you do choose embryo adoption, you have to go into it with the mindset of you are here to shepherd children through a kind of questions and scenarios that humanity has never had to answer before, right? A friend of mine just recently embryo adopted the oldest babies ever to be born alive. And they had been abandoned. Well, they had been created 30 years ago and abandoned, and she had twins from them. Incredibly noble, right? They absolutely did this in a pro-life way, going after the kids that were the most forsaken. They're going to have some really hard questions to answer about where the biological siblings are. The fact that their mother was a egg donor that they'll never know, and their father was 80 years old by the time they were born. I mean, you're going to have to be prepared to bear the burden of these kids through what is going to be really challenging identity questions that they have. Beyond even the question of artificial wombs, which what that means is I think a lot of people in the pro-life world say, oh, yay, artificial wombs. Now, if children are at risk of preterm labor, we can put them in an artificial womb. Maybe, But what this really means is factory floors of designer children. I mean, right now, we already have overseas Chinese who are coming to the United States because it's illegal in China, implanting multiple surrogates and then deciding which baby they like, and then kind of selectively reducing or completely aborting the ones that they don't want at all, right? Selective reduction and abortion is standard language in a surrogate contract. And very often the only person standing between the baby and the knife is the one person that actually has a bond with them. And that is the surrogate mother, right? Who supposedly is just an oven for somebody else's bun. When you are trying to create a baby, you have to find sperm, egg, and womb. Sperm is super cheap and easy to get. Eggs, harder to get, but still accessible. Wombs are the most expensive and hard to attain part of that equation. And if you could just cut out having a physical woman involved at all, you would save so much money. You could implant 10 different kids, right? With a variety of different characteristics, see which one you like, and then, terminate 8 of them and keep the 2 that you want. I mean, do you understand? Like, you were talking about factories of children. Like, we can't even get serious about the moral clarity on surrogacy. You better get this straight right now, because artificial wombs, it is going to be customized designer children at bottom basement prices. So not only that, but we now have 3 parent embryos, right? That a couple weeks ago, the UK just announced that they had the first 3 parent embryo, which just means carving out the mitochondria from one egg, putting in healthy mitochondria from the other. So trace amounts of genetics from one parent, but largely 2. And they're calling this like a reparative kind of therapy. The experimentation on children is not going to stop. So we have to get very clear about the very obvious violations of children's rights right now, and the willingness to defend children's rights to their mother and father right now, regardless of how many of our friends might feel sad about this stance, or how many people we might offend on Twitter. Because if we don't have clarity about this right now, we are talking about the violations of children's rights on a mass scale, because the technologies coming down the pipe are way, way more dystopic than whatever we've got happening today.
Right. The Vatican actually called this situation with the 1 million frozen embryos a situation of injustice, which cannot, in fact, be resolved. Very, very heavy, serious stuff that we're already in.
Right.
We're up against a lot. So given that we are up against a lot, what can people do concretely to take action on behalf of children?
Well, my answer is you have to become an expert. Nobody else is going to do this for us. Like, it's not even on many politicians' radar. And even if it was, I don't know if they'd have the courage to stand up and say something, right? Because it implicates their own decisions or the decisions of their friends or whatever it is. I mean, we have been so squeamish about advocating on behalf of children because we've been so worried about hurting the feelings of adults. So even though I am like a grace giver by nature, the fact that children are being harmed has pushed, gotten me out of my shell and said, somebody's got to stand up for these kids. Media is against you, education's against you, academia is like in the tank. It's been absolutely captured. Nobody is going to do this except you and me, period. Nobody is going to do this except you. Nobody is going to speak up on behalf of children except you and me and your listeners and ordinary people that still remember that children deserve to have a mom and dad and be loved by them. They shouldn't be bought and sold and designed and discarded. And that, yeah, that's hard. That's a hard message, because that means that all of us have to do hard things on behalf of children. But what's the alternative? Buying and selling kids? I mean, let's stand up to that. So we wrote the book so that you can be an expert on the subject. We just started a podcast to sort of get this information into people's hearts and minds in another format. But like, get on board with us. I mean, honestly, I'm so grateful for the Catholics. My husband's a Baptist pastor, but a lot of people assume I'm Catholic because, like, evangelicals, they're not even talking about this, So I'm so grateful that the Catholic Church is stalwart on this. And I think that they've got a huge role to play in obviously standing by the teachings of the Catholic Church, but learning to phrase it and talk about it in a way that's accessible to non-Catholics as well, which is one of the reasons why we use natural law and the stories of kids to communicate these truths, because that's accessible to everyone.
Right.
So what can you do? I'd say become an expert, and that will fuel you. It will make you courageous because you will have so much contact with the kids who are impacted and harmed through these technologies. It will spur you on to speak out on their behalf.
Hmm. Is there anything else we haven't discussed already that you think listeners should know?
No, because we talked about adoption, which is normally the big hangup. But just know that, like, I'm an adoptive mom. I absolutely believe that adoption is a just society's response to children who have lost their parents. You can 100% advocate for the natural family and also recognize that adoption is an institution centered around the well-being of children. So that's oftentimes the one thing that you have to hit at the end of these kinds of podcasts, because adoption is redemptive, right? But it doesn't come without a cost to kids. And so we can be really honest about that. No, I think that's it. I'm really grateful that you let me talk to you and your audience for an
Yeah,
hour.
it's beautiful. Can I ask a follow-up question? Do
Yeah,
we have time?
of course.
So as an adoptive family, I know that can be a really big struggle of discernment for families who feel that on their hearts. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice for people who are in that place?
In the place of wondering if they should do it.
Mhm.
Okay, I just answered this question because a friend asked me to write an article. So I have got my thoughts straight. So I'll tell you, if I have a chance to write an article, this is what I'd say. If you're feeling burdened by that, you need to listen. I don't think everybody is called to adopt, because the reality is that adoption is hard, especially if you're not going to be one of the adults who gets in the years-long line for a white drug-free infant, where there's dozens of people that are ready to adopt those kids. If you feel called to get a special needs child or a sibling group or a foster child or a child with disabilities, you need to know that that's from God, because it will be hard. And the temptation is that when something gets hard, we say, did God really say? So you need to be sure ahead of time that that's exactly what he wants, so that you can be faithful in the midst of the challenges. And then if he's calling you to do it, there's a verse in James that says, he who knows what he ought to do but does not do it, to him it is sin. So I don't think it's sinful to not adopt if you don't feel called to it. But if you feel called to it and you don't, that is sinful.
Mm.
If you don't feel called to adopt, I would strongly encourage you to figure out a way to support somebody who is, whether that is throwing money at them so that they can pay for all of the clearances and background checks and the travel, overseas or whatever that entails, or building a relationship with them so that you can give them a weekend off and be the people that watches the kids while they get away for a bit of a respite. If you don't feel called to adopt, throw your weight behind somebody who does, because especially in the first couple of years, it can really upend your world. So yeah, ask God about it and think about it. And if he calls you to do it, don't resist that call.
Beautiful. I can't think of a better way to end than to just say resounding, do what God calls you to do. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. Where can listeners find you, your book, your new podcast?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thenbeforeus.com. You can go down and you can subscribe, and then you'll get all the podcasts when they come out. I think you can find the book on the website too, but it's at Amazon. Them Before Us, Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement. If your listeners might be familiar, Robert George wrote the foreword for the book, which is,
That's exciting.
let's just say he's a Catholic superstar, right? I don't think that's a stretch to say he's a superstar. It was really honored that he wrote it for us. The podcast is on Spotify right now, soon to be on Apple Podcasts as well. But going to the website, getting on our list, that's the best way to stay in touch. Oh, I'm on Twitter. Lots and lots of opinions from me happening on Twitter. So you can find me there too.
Yes, I've been following. I think that's how I found you, was on Twitter, and love the stuff that you're putting out there. Very, like you said, very empowering to know these things and then to be able to become that expert and share them with people. So thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate you being here and sharing all of your wisdom with us.
Good luck with your podcast. I hope it is shared widely.
Thank you.